They knew nothing, and so they believed. A few quotes from one British propaganda publication called The Ottoman Domination. Quote, "The breaking up of Turkey is not the destruction of a living commonwealth, but a liberation of enslaved peoples from prison. The Turks' hand was against every man, and none they conquered became reconciled to their rule. The first phase of Ottoman policy towards subject peoples was neglect. The Hamidian, the Abdulhamid II's phase was attrition, but the young Turkish phase is extermination." This book claimed that the Turks had killed 2 million Armenians, which was considerably more than there were in the Ottoman Empire, and now the Turks were beginning to exterminate the Arabs. Other British propaganda books reported that the Sheikh al-Islam had ordered Muslims to kill all Christians, that the Kurds as well as the Arabs would soon be exterminated. In 1913, Turks were engaged in exterminating the Albanians. So now you see the Turks have now killed not only the Armenians, but the Arabs, the Kurds, and the Albanians. Did people believe it? Yes. After the Balkan Wars, Turks, according to this propaganda, Turks had, quote, exterminated all the Greeks and Slavs left in their territories. Notice the use of the word exterminated. In English, exterminated is what you do to bugs, is what people do when they step on a cockroach. The Turks were described as unchangeably brutal, as shown by their blood-stained history. The propagandists wrote, "You cannot reason or argue with the Turk, nor can you expect justice or ordinary human feelings from such a nature." Turks were described as inferior to other people. They had only been successful because they were good at killing. They had, quote, maimed and warped more gifted peoples. Turks had no civilization, nothing but the military tradition of violence and cunning. The Turk was described as a merciless oppressor, a remorseless bully, pure barbarians, degenerate, and one who has strewn the earth with ruins. Not very nice, is it? I'm sorry not to give you a happier speech. I decided instead to try to give you a true one. Articles written by British propaganda were planted in British and American newspapers. British propaganda had the cooperation of the American government, which simply closed its eyes, pretended it didn't exist. The greatest aid that the Americans gave to the British was allowing the British to come in and to use their propaganda freely in America, which was of course illegal, but the government did not mention that it happened. All the propaganda that the British passed to Americans was portrayed as coming from private citizens, not from the British government. The man who led British propaganda in America was Sir Gilbert Parker. He wrote, I quote, "In fact, we have an organization extraordinarily widespread in the United States, but which does not know it is an organization. It is worked entirely by personal association and inspired by voluntary effort, which has grown more enthusiastic and pronounced with the passage of time." And he goes on. By 1917, Parker was distributing to 170,000 addresses in the United States. And most of the material that went to those addresses was spread among many people. It was shared by those who received it. 555 American newspapers were sent the propaganda against the Turks and the Germans. All the important people in America received this propaganda. Parker, Sir Gilbert Parker, listed as receiving British propaganda scientists, lawyers, bishops, ministers, senators and congressmen, judges, college presidents, businessmen, superintendents who ran American schools, rich men's clubs, and of course, newspapers and libraries. And I just gave you a partial list. There were many thousands of people who received everything that they sent out. In fact, everyone who was important in America received this propaganda. In other words, British propaganda was everywhere in America. Its lies came at the same time as those told by the missionary establishment. The missionaries and British propaganda supported each other. The missionaries recommended the British propaganda works to Americans. The British used missionary propaganda to write their books and articles. Both missionaries and British said that the work of the other proved that what they said was true. Both were believed. And of course, what were the Americans to think? The missionaries were trusted because of their calling. They told the Americans that the Turks were fiends. Books and articles arrived from British propaganda that said exactly the same thing. No one spoke for the Turks. Now, we should note the story that was told. First of all, the Turks disliked the Armenians because of religious prejudice and because of Turkish nationalism. Secondly, Turks attacked Armenians even though Armenians had always been peaceful and had never hurt the Turks. Third, Armenians were deported because the Turks hated them. The deportations were actually intended to kill all the Armenians. Fourth, Armenians were a majority in eastern Anatolia, or at least the largest group, and they deserved a separate state of their own. And fifth, it was the duty of Americans and Europeans to help the Armenians gain their goals. Does this remind you of anything? It is exactly the same story that was told by the missionaries, and it is exactly the same story that is told by Armenian nationalists today, and it is all lies. After 1922, there was relative quiet. Both British propaganda and the American missionary efforts were over. From 1930 to 1970, the Armenian question went into the background. Armenians busied themselves making new lives in America and elsewhere. But while anti-Turkish feelings were quiet, they were not forgotten. Newspapers and magazines occasionally brought up the old stories. But the worst was the effect on education. Textbooks taught American school children the Turks had massacred Armenians. Indeed, textbooks seldom said anything but bad of the Turks. The most commonly